There is a place you keep returning to, not in the outer world, but within you. A feeling, and no matter what changes around you, you find yourself back there. You may call it circumstances. You may call it bad timing. You may call it the way things are. But it is the same place. And tonight I want to show you exactly where that place is and how one man walked out of it entirely. I have seen men receive large sums of money and lose every dollar within months. Not because of bad luck, not because of poor decisions, because they never actually left the place they had always lived. And I have seen men with nothing, no connections, no inheritance, no external reason whatsoever, quietly become the kind of person the world could not stop providing for. The difference was not visible, it was not measurable, it was a feeling, a habitual, invisible feeling that one had changed and the other had not. I want to tell you about one man in particular, a man who sat in front of me and told me with complete conviction that the world was designed against him by the accident of his birth. 3 years later, he sat in an elegant office and told me he would net $250,000 that year. Nothing external changed first. Only one thing changed. And if you have ever worked hard and returned to where you started, if you have ever received money and watched it disappear, if you have ever felt that something invisible is holding you in a place you have been trying to leave for years, then what changed for him is the same thing that can change for you tonight. I want to show you what I mean through a man I met some years ago in this very city. Before one of my lectures, he sought an audience with me. He was not without intelligence. He was not without ambition. But he carried something with him that was heavier than either of those things, a story. A story he had been telling himself for so long that he had mistaken it for a fact. The story was this, that the world was against him by reason of the accident of his birth, his background, his race, the family he came from, the opportunities that had been withheld from him before he was old enough to pursue them. He believed this with a certainty that felt like wisdom, as though he had simply looked at the evidence and drawn the only reasonable conclusion. And in one sense, he was not wrong to have looked. The evidence was there. The limitations were real. The doors that had been closed to him were genuinely closed. But here is what he had not yet understood. The evidence was not the cause. The evidence was the mirror. And the mirror was faithfully reflecting the state from which he had been viewing the world every single day of his life. He was not poor because of his birth. He was poor because every morning he woke up and returned without thinking to the habitual feeling of a man whom the world had already decided against. And that feeling, that invisible posture of the self, was silently instructing everything around him to confirm what he already believed. I did not argue with his evidence. I simply showed him where his real dwelling place was. I told him what I am telling you now. The state of consciousness to which you most constantly return is the place you really dwell, not the house you sleep in, not the office you work in, is the feeling you live inside. And I told him something else that I want you to hear very carefully. You can wear a feeling until it becomes natural. You can occupy a new state as you would a new room, awkward at first, until one day it feels like home. He did not need to pretend he was wealthy. He did not need to construct elaborate scenes of success or force himself into feelings he did not yet possess. He needed only to begin disentangling his sense of self from the story his past had written for him. This took him 3 years. I tell you this not to discourage you, but to honor what is true. The feeling of naturalness cannot be rushed. It can only be worn day after day until the old state loses its grip and the new one feels like the only thing that is real. For 3 years, he worked at nothing visible. He changed no circumstance. He made no dramatic gesture. He simply refused, each time the old feeling rose, to return to it as though it were home. And here is what I want you to understand about those 3 years. Every day he did not do this, the world continued to reflect what he had always been. The law does not pause while you decide. It does not wait. It simply mirrors whatever state you are inhabiting, which means that every morning you wake up and return without thinking to the old feeling is another morning the mirror reflects it. And then one afternoon he invited me to his office. The office was elegant. I noticed it immediately. Not ostentatious, but the quiet, unhurried elegance of a man who has stopped apologizing for what he occupies. He said to me, "Neville, this year I will net $250,000. The same man, the same birth, the same world that had, by his own account, been arranged against him. And yet here he was, in an office that could not be explained by the story he had once believed, telling me a figure that would have been unimaginable to the person he was 3 years before." 3 people, when I told the story at another gathering, asked me the same question. They said, "He must have had money to begin with. He must have known the right people. There must have been some external advantage that made this possible." I did not go through his books. I did not verify the details. But I will tell you this, with complete conviction. There was no hidden advantage, no secret connection, no external reason that explained what happened to him. The only thing that changed was inside. What changed was not his circumstances. What changed was the place he returned to each morning, the feeling he inhabited, the state from which he had learned, slowly and with great patience, to view the world. He knows now that he is what he is by virtue of the state of consciousness with which he is identified. And the choice is his at any moment to return to the old story or to remain in the freedom he has found. Now I bring this to you, not as inspiration, as a precise instruction. You already have a habitual state. And if you are honest with yourself tonight, you know what it is. You know the feeling that rises the moment you see your bank balance, the feeling that appears when money is mentioned, the quiet weight that settles in your chest when you consider the distance between where you are and where you want to be. That feeling is not a reaction to your circumstances. It is the cause of them. It is the state from which you have been viewing the world, and the world has been faithfully reflecting it back to you. Because the same state that has been creating this condition can be changed from the inside tonight. Here is what this looks like in practice. Once a day, you pause before the old feeling takes over. When the bill arrives, when money is mentioned, when the distance becomes visible, in that moment, you pause, and for 30 seconds, you inhabit a different state. This is where your life is decided, not in grand gestures, not in dramatic decisions, in that one moment when the old feeling rises, and you do not return to it. Ask yourself this: what would it feel like in your body if sufficiency were the condition of your life? Not wealth as a dream, not abundance as an idea, simply enough. Find that feeling, wear it for 30 seconds without asking the outer world to confirm it. And here is how you will know it is working. Not by watching your bank account, not by measuring the outer world against the inner act. You will know it is working when the feeling of sufficiency begins to feel less like an act and more like a fact. When you no longer remind yourself, to wear it. When it begins to wear you, this is what I call the feeling of naturalness. It cannot be forced. It cannot be faked, but it can be measured. Ask yourself each week, does this feel more natural than it did 7 days ago? If yes, you are moving. If not, you are still returning to the old home. And that is not failure. It is simply what you must see. The man in that office did not get there because something external changed first.
Mm.
He got there because he changed what he was willing to call home. That choice is yours tonight. Now, let us go into the silence.